back, everyone, to season 5 on Cabin of Horrors podcast. Thank you so much for sticking around, being a part of the Cabin of Horrors community, and I hope you like the season that we have coming up for you, because I'm telling you right now, there's going to be a lot of awesome movies that we're going to talk about. We're going to be diving into even more folklore. It's going to be awesome. So thanks for being here. We're cranking up the drill tonight on one of the most misunderstood and surprisingly revolutionary slashers of the 1980s, the Slumber Party Massacre. Now, of course, when you hear that title, you might expect, a cheap, sleazy slasher flick filled with half-dressed teenagers and blood-drenched cliches. Well, you're not wrong necessarily, but beneath that glossy, blood-splattered surface lies something far smarter and far more subversive than anybody would have ever expected when this film first hit theaters in 1982. This is the story of how a movie written by a feminist screenwriter and directed by a woman and dismissed as exploitation trash actually ended up drilling a hole straight through the heart of the slasher stereotypes, and it left its mark on horror history. So let's dive into the Slumber Party Massacre. This is a film that proved that the final girl could fight back with power tools. Now, as we all know, the 1980s, early 1980s especially, were the golden age of the slasher, right? We had Halloween come out in 1978, then we had Friday the 13th come out in 1980. Studios were super desperate to cash in on the formula. A mass killer, isolated teens, a signature weapon, and plenty of gore. And the market was flooded with cheap independent slashers during this time. But Slumber Party Massacre was different. And not because it reinvented the wheel in any way, but because it was written as a parody of the wheel. The original screenplay was titled Don't Open the Door, and it was written by Rita Mae Brown, who was a well-known feminist author and activist. Brown, who was famous for her work on Ruby Fruit Jungle, wanted to mock the rising trend of misogyny in slasher films, the way women were objectified, brutalized, and stripped of agency on screen. Her script was biting satire. It was poking fun at the absurd tropes that dominated the genre. But when Roger Corman, the legendary king of low-budget exploitation films, when he got his hands on it, things changed. Corman was the founder of New World Pictures. It was a company known for producing inexpensive but profitable genre movies. He saw Don't Open the Door not as satire, but as a marketable slasher with a built-in audience. So he financed it under the new title, The Slumber Party Massacre. And it was assigned to Amy Holden Jones to direct, and he told her to make it scary and sexy. At that time, Jones was a promising editor and filmmaker who'd worked with Martin Scorsese and Joe Dante. She was looking for her big break at this point, and this movie was it. But here's the twist. Amy Holden Jones decided to keep the bones of Brown's satire intact. So she shot it like a traditional slasher, but she directed it with a subtle knowing wink. And the result was a movie that looks like a sleazy exploitation flick, but feels like a critique of one instead. Production on The Slumber Party Massacre began in 1981 in Los Angeles, and it was on a shoestring budget, about $220,000. It was filmed mostly in a suburban neighborhood using local homes, which gave the movie that cozy, sun-bleached California feel, and it made the violence hit even harder. Amy Holden Jones wanted to shoot it fast, efficient, and stylish. She used her editing background to plan each scene carefully, maximizing the film's pace and tension without overspending. The cinematographer of the film, Stephen L. Posey, was tasked with creating a balance between realism and tension. He used natural lighting during the daytime sequences to evoke a normal suburban life, and harsh shadows and narrow focus at night to emphasize claustrophobia. This duality gave a comfort versus chaos feel, which gives the movie its unsettling tone. And one of the most iconic visual choices was how the camera framed the killer's weapon, which was a power drill. The drill is both obviously absurd and obviously symbolic. It's over-the-top phallic, almost cartoonish, and it's exactly the kind of exaggerated imagery that Rita Mae Brown intended in her satire. So Jones and Posey leaned into this with tight, lingering close-ups of the drill, making it not just a tool of death, but a commentary on male aggression itself. And the killer, his name was Russ Thorne. He was played by a man named Michael Vallela. and he approached the role like a method actor. Villella had studied the behavior of predators, stalking animals, and serial killers in order to make his movements animalistic and unpredictable. He said he wanted Thorne to feel like a man possessed by the drill, not the other way around. Corman had reportedly told Jones to include the quote-unquote required amount of nudity and gore for New World's audience, because a lot of Corman films during this time and even before it had a lot of nudity and gore. And Jones, of course, complied, but she shot these scenes differently than her male contemporaries. She didn't fetishize on the female body. Instead, she made the voyeurism feel uncomfortable, intentionally subverting the male gaze. So while you see the tropes, like the shower scenes, the lingerie, the blood, it all feels slightly off. And that was Jones's quiet rebellion against the exploitation expectations. Now let's talk story of the Slumber Party Massacre. It follows a group of teenage girls, Trish, Kim, Jackie, and Diane, who decide to throw a sleepover while Trish's parents are out of town. Meanwhile, there's an escaped mass murderer, Russ Thorne, who's stalking the neighborhood armed with a power drill the size of a small sword. It's a setup that we've seen 1,000 times, but what makes this work is the tone. The movie walks the line between parody and genuine horror so delicately that audiences in 1982 didn't quite know what to make of it. The opening scene alone tells you what you're in for. Trish wakes up, gets dressed, throws out her childhood toys, and within minutes, we get a locker room scene, a killer on the loose, and a series of eerie near misses. But it's not all predictable. The film constantly toys with expectations, because characters who would normally survive die early. And the killer doesn't wear a mask. He's just an average-looking guy, which makes him even that more scarier. And the girls themselves, they're not helpless victims. They fight back, they defend each other, and ultimately, they win. The final sequence of the film, where Trish, Val, and Courtney confront Russ Thorne, is one of the most brutal and cathartic showdowns of early 80s horror. The girls literally castrate the killer symbolically by impaling him with his own drill. It's a clear feminist metaphor, the ultimate reversal of slasher power dynamics. Now let's dig deeper into the filmography and cinematography, because the Slumber Party Massacre deserves way more credit than it gets for its visual language. Amy Holden Jones directed the movie like a traditional thriller, emphasizing composition over chaos. Every frame was calculated. She often used wide shots to build spatial awareness inside the house and letting the audience know exactly where the danger could come from. Then, as the killer closes in, the shots tighten. The camera gets closer, the angle sharper, and the cuts even faster. Posey's cinematography favors handheld movements during chase sequences, and this gives it a raw, almost documentary-like tension. It's a style that predates the found footage trend by over a decade. And the lighting of the film is especially interesting, because night scenes are lit in dark blues and browns rather than garish reds, which grounds us in that believability and that actual realism that the violence is. Jones also uses sound, that piercing drill whine, as a reoccurring auditory cue of dread. Every time you hear it spin up, it's like Pavlovian terror. Editing also played a major role in this too. Jones herself handled much of the editing, cutting the film with the same sharp rhythm she learned from working under Scorsese. She wanted it tight, fast, and lean. No wasted frames, no lingering exposition. And this is why the movie clocks in at just 77 minutes. It never overstays its welcome. Now here's where it gets juicy. Let's talk about the behind the scenes, because this movie's production is filled with fascinating stories. So Amy Holden Jones actually turned down the role of editing E.T. to make the Slumber Party Massacre, which is absolutely wild. She was offered the job by Steven Spielberg himself, but she wanted to direct, and Corman gave her the chance. I would say it's a career gamble that totally paid off. Rita Mae Brown, however, actually hated how the film turned out. She was furious that her feminist parody had been turned into what looked like another exploitative slasher. But over time, Brown admitted that the satire still shone through, just in a more subtle, layered way. Michael Villalla's performance of Russ Thorne actually freaked out the cast. He stayed in character between takes, lurking around the set and staring silently at his co-stars to help build tension. He kept that method actor approach all the way throughout shooting. And Jones later said that this actually worked. His presence was genuinely unsettling. And the drill itself, the infamous power drill, was actually an industrial drill attached to a long cord. It wasn't a prop, it wasn't fake, it was real. And it overheated constantly, and it nearly injured Valilla several times. You can even kind of see him struggling with its weight in some of the shots. When Slumber Party Massacre first premiered in 1982, critics didn't quite know how to react. Many dismissed it as cheap trash. Variety actually called it a predictable formula slasher, while others accused it of hypocrisy, claiming that its feminist message was buried under exploitation tropes. But us horror fans, we got it. It became a cult favorite, particularly among female horror fans and scholars. Because beneath the gore, Slumber Party Massacre was doing something quietly revolutionary, putting women in control of their own horror narrative. The final girl trope got turned on its head here. Instead of one pure survivor, all the girls band together. And they're not punished for their sexuality. They're punished for existing in a world built for male violence, and they survive by reclaiming that violence. Over time, critics reevaluated it. Writers like Carol J. Clover, in her seminal book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, pointed out how Slumber Party Massacre deconstructed gender in horror long before it was trendy. Even contemporary directors like Karen Kusama of Jennifer's Body and Ty West of X, they've cited this movie as an influence for how it blurs satire and slasher. It's also one of the few horror franchises entirely directed by women, which is groundbreaking in an industry that still struggles with gender equity behind the camera. Now, of course, let's talk about the amount of influence Slumber Party Massacre had, because it left a bigger footprint than most people realize. In the early 1980s, slashers were totally formulaic, right? Like we mentioned before, there was a mass killer, blood, gore, body count, moral lesson about sex and sin. But Slumber Party Massacre quietly dismantled that formula from the inside out. It didn't necessarily make fun of slashers. It was a slasher, but it was smarter. It delivered the thrills and kills that audiences expected while simultaneously mocking their expectations. And you can see echoes of this tone and themes in later meta-horror films, movies like Scream, Cabin in the Woods, and even Jennifer's Body. Each of those films owes something to the groundwork laid by Amy Holden Jones, using horror tropes to critique gender and violence. It also inspired a new wave of female-directed horror. Without Slumber Party Massacre, you might not have seen filmmakers like Mary Harron, who directed American Psycho, Jennifer Kent, who did The Babadook, or Julia Ducournau, who did Raw. Jones proved that women can make horror bloody, funny, and biting, and still turn a profit. Today, the Slumber Party Massacre is viewed as a feminist cult classic. It's a film that was product and parody of its time. What's fascinating is that it still works as a straightforward horror movie. Even if you miss the satire, the scares still land. Russ Thorne's slow, deliberate stalking sequences are genuinely creepy. The kills are practical and effective, and the finale delivers real catharsis. But when you do catch the subtext, the jokes about male voyeurism, the irony of the drill, the solidarity of the girls, it becomes something deeper. It's not just about surviving the night, it's about reclaiming fear itself. This layered approach paved the way for modern horror films that can be both terrifying and socially aware. Movies like Get Out or Ready or Not and Barbarian, they all owe a small debt to the groundwork that Slumber Party Massacre laid decades earlier. In the end, Slumber Party Massacre will always stand as one of horror's greatest contradictions. It's sleazy, it's smart, exploitative, and empowering, a parody and a product. It's exactly why it endures. Amy Holden Jones didn't just make another slasher. She made a statement wrapped in blood and satire, and in doing so, she helped carve a space for women's voices in horror, both in front of and behind the camera. So the next time someone dismisses it as just another cheesy 80s slasher, remind them that this movie was written by a feminist, directed by a woman, and distributed by the king of exploitation, and somehow still became one of the most important slashers ever made. And that, my friends, is the real massacre. Next up, we're going to be heading into a review of the novel The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. But before we do, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you haven't subscribed yet, whether you're listening to YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, wherever you're listening to this right now, I would absolutely love if you click the follow or subscribe button, whatever is there. It helps get the podcast out to more people, and you also get notifications when the next episode's going live. And trust me, you don't want to miss any of the future episodes, because I'm telling you, we're going over some really cool movies, really cool novels, and we're diving real deep into some seriously terrifying folklore. So please hit that follow, subscribe button, whatever is there on the platform you're listening on. And if you haven't checked us out yet on social media, we're on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, X, pretty much every platform. So come find us, follow us, leave some comments, talk to us. I love talking to people about horror. So if you have anything that you want to ask, anything you want to talk about, or even anything you want to see on future episodes of the podcast, come drop by my socials and let me know. I would love to hear from you. Now let's head into The Final Girl Support Group. This was a novel that aimed to be a love letter to the slasher genre and the women who survived it. But it ended up, in my opinion, more like a poorly taped together scrapbook of cliches. It's honestly, though, a book that should have worked. It has final girls, trauma, and a feminist reimagining of horror tropes. But instead of reanimating the genre, the novel feels like a corpse propped up for one last scare. So we're going to break down the blood and bones of The Final Girl Support Group, its inspirations, the behind-the-scenes development, its influence from horror cinema, and why, despite all its potential, this book barely earns 2 stars in my ledger. So let's start with what The Final Girl Support Group was supposed to be. It was published in 2021 by Berkeley Books, which is part of Penguin Random House. The novel follows Lynette Tarkington, who's a self-proclaimed final girl. She's one of several women who survived different massacres, which are actually very similar to famous slasher movies, like Friday the 13th, Scream, Halloween, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These women, each loosely inspired by iconic survivors like Laurie Strode, Sidney Prescott, Sally Hardesty, they've all banded together in a support group led by a therapist. And the idea is trauma healing, solidarity, and survival. But one of them goes missing, and the group unravels, and Lynette is thrust into yet another fight for her life. On paper, this is brilliant. It's meta, it's modern, and it's dripping with nostalgia. And Grady Hendrix clearly understands horror history, and The Final Girl Support Group was marketed as his love letter to the genre that defined a generation. But somewhere between the pitch and the page, something went wrong. Now, before we carve into the story itself, let's talk about the making of this book, because Grady Hendrix didn't just stumble onto this idea overnight. After the success of his earlier works, My Best Friend's Exorcism, We Sold Our Souls, and the Selden Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, Hendrix became one of the biggest names in quote-unquote paperback horror revival. He's known for blending humor, nostalgia, and horror, tapping into the paperback horror boom of the 80s and giving it a new feminist pop culture-aware voice. The Final Girl Support Group was conceived around 2018-2019, just as Hollywood's obsession with slashers was revving up again. We had Halloween in 2018, Scream coming in 2022, countless other remakes. Hendrix reportedly spent 2 years researching slasher history. He studied survivors in both fiction and reality, piecing together a narrative that would blend true crime energy with horror meta commentary. Berkeley had given the novel a very strong marketing push, with a reported 6-figure advance and a major publicity campaign aimed at both horror fans and mainstream thriller readers. There was even talk of a TV adaptation before the book's release. HBO Max was rumored to have picked it up, with Charlize Theron attached as a producer. So, yes, The Final Girl Support Group wasn't a small indie horror paperback. It was a high-profile, high-expectation release from one of the genre's most marketable modern voices. But as we'll see, the final product couldn't quite survive its own hype. Let's move into style, okay? Because Hendrix's writing has always been polarizing. In The Final Girl Support Group, he leans hard into a frantic, stream of consciousness voice from Lynette's perspective. Everything is filtered through Lynette's trauma: paranoia, anxiety, constant movement. She's always hiding and planning escape routes, obsessing over safety protocols. Really, her entire world is survival. Now, conceptually, that's fantastic, We finally get to feel what a final girl might live with years after the credits roll, but in execution, it's exhausting. Hendricks writes Lynette's inner world like a caffeine overdose, fragmented thoughts, disjointed sentences, and endless internal panic. And that might work for short bursts, but over 350 pages, it becomes suffocating. The pacing never breathes. Every moment is either frantic running or heavy exposition dumps about the fictionalized massacres. It's meant to mirror a slasher's pacing with constant tension, no release, but books don't benefit from that the same way movies do. Without moments of calm or genuine character reflection, readers can't connect emotionally. So instead of empathy, you feel fatigue. And that brings us to the biggest problem this novel faces. For a book that's all about final girls, the women in the final girl support group feel strangely hollow, like cardboard cutouts of their movie count. Each member of the group is modeled after an iconic horror heroine. Adrian mirrors Friday the 13th's Alice, who is a lake survivor turned activist. Marilyn channels Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Sally Hardesty. Danny resembles Halloween's Laurie Strode. Heather is a nod to Nightmare on Elm Street's Nancy. Chrissy mirrors Scream's Sidney Prescott. And Lynette, our narrator, is a little bit of all of them. Paranoid, scarred, forever haunted. But here's the thing. They're not characters. They're references. Hendricks spends so much time winking at the genre that he forgets to flesh out his cast beyond their archetypes. We're told what they've been through, but rarely shown who they are. They don't grow, they don't evolve, they just exist to fulfill a slasher checklist. Even Lynette, who should be the heart of the story, feels like a caricature of trauma, not a person living through it. Her paranoia defines her completely. There's no nuance and no internal progression. It's like she's stuck on page 1 emotionally, all the way to the end. Now, some defenders argue that that's the point, that trauma freezes people in place. But fiction isn't therapy. Readers still need layers, not just repetition. You can feel Hendricks' admiration for final girls, though, but admiration isn't characterization. It creates homage without the humanity, and in a story about survival, that's fatal. Plot-wise, the final girl support group starts strong. There's a murder, the group is attacked, survivors scatter, and Lynette goes on the run. But halfway through, the book loses all sense of direction. The pacing becomes erratic, scenes drag or overlap, and twists feel both predictable and contrived. We move from therapy sessions to car chases to gunfights, and then to bizarre encounters with secondary characters who just vanish as quickly as they appear. It's as if Hendricks wanted to write both a thriller and a meta-horror commentary, but couldn't decide which lane to stay in. And the result is tonal whiplash. One page feels like Halloween, the next like Jason Bourne. And despite all the blood and violence, the tension never lands because the stakes themselves never feel personal. The characters are so emotionally distant that you don't care who survives. You're just watching a literary slasher reel. Hits all the beats, ticks all the boxes, fade to black. But by the third act, when the killer's identity is revealed, the twist lands with a dull thud. It's predictable, over-explained, and playing it completely safe. And that's actually one word that haunts this novel. Safe. For a book built around the idea of breaking free from genre expectations, it never truly takes any risks. Now let's talk a little bit about influence, because the Final Girl support group owes everything to the horror lineage that came before it. Hendricks clearly pulls from the holy trinity of slashers, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. You can see these influences in the structure, tone, and even the fictionalized massacres that mirror their cinematic predecessors. But what's interesting and disappointing is how surface level these references feel. Instead of deconstructing what made those films culturally resonant, the morality politics, the voyeurism, the gender anxiety, Hendricks just recreates them in book form. It's like painting over an old VHS cover without ever pressing play. The novel flirts with commentary about media exploitation and the trauma of being commodified, but never really commits to exploring them. It wants to say something profound about how society consumes women's pain as entertainment, but instead, it becomes the very thing it's criticizing. In contrast, earlier books and films that played with the final girl deconstruction, like Carol J. Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws, or movies like Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, did it with a much more sharper intent. The Final Girl support group borrows the aesthetic of slasher analysis, but forgets to cut deep. At its core, the book is about trauma, about how surviving horror doesn't mean escaping it. Lynette lives like a prisoner of her own past, believing danger lurks in every corner. And that's a compelling setup, but the execution falters because the book doesn't trust its readers. Every theme is over-explained and every metaphor is spelled out. There's no subtlety or psychological depth, just exposition, a lecture about trauma instead of a lived experience. You can compare this to The Babadook or Midsummer, films that explore grief and trauma through emotion, not explanation. Hendricks tells us how Lynette feels, but never lets us feel it with her. That's where her usual satirical bite works against him. In books like My Best Friend's Exorcism, humor balances the horror. Here, it trivializes it. So instead of insight, we get irony, and instead of emotional connection, we get empty cleverness. You can almost see the movie Hendricks wanted this to be. Fast cuts, flashbacks, emotional showdowns, the tension of women reclaiming their trauma. But what works on screen doesn't always translate to print. Books need interiority, character emotion, psychological nuance, and that's where this one fails. Lynette reads like an unreliable narrator, not compelling in a way, but more like an unrelatable one. Her paranoia could have been the story's greatest asset, but without moments of empathy or vulnerability, it becomes noise. This book screams for adaptation because its concept is cinematic, but as a novel, it feels unfinished, like a screenplay draft that never found its soul. So here's my verdict. Final Girl Support Group gets 2 out of 5 stars. 1 star for the concept because it really is brilliant, and 1 star for Hendricks' ambition. His genuine love of horror really does bleed through every page. But the rest, it's lost in the mess. The writing's chaotic, characters are archetypes, not people, the pacing burns out before the third act even begins, and the so-called meta-commentary is too obvious to be insightful. It's a book that mistakes references for resonance. It tells us horror matters, but never makes us feel it. If you want a story about trauma and survival that truly digs into what it means to be a final girl, look to Final Girls by Riley Sager or rewatch Scream from 2022. Both explore the same ideas with sharper focus and better emotional payoff. Hendricks had the toolbox, the talent, and the theme, but this time the drill just spun in place. And that's it for our deep dive into Final Girl Support Group and Slumber Party Massacre. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think on my socials. And if you survived tonight's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Cabin of Horrors wherever you are listening to this. Click either subscribe, follow, whatever button they have. And that way you never miss when we cut deep into every corner of the horror genre, from the classics to the modern misfires. Until next time, lock your doors and check under the bed. And remember, sometimes survival isn't the same as living.